Ok, boa tarde. Eu vou falar inglês, certo? Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome here at the Institute for Social and Political Studies of the State University of Rio de Janeiro, Professor, Doctor, activist, transnational global activist, Walden Bello. Really, thank you so much for giving some of your time to have this talk with us. Professor and Walden is, perhaps as many of you know, from the Philippines. He took his PhD in Princeton in 1975. He has been working with the University of Philippines for many years, but he's very widely and globally known as an activist for human rights, anti-globalization movements. He was one of the co-founders of the Focus on the Global South in 1995. He was a very, very important member of the International Council of the Social Forum, World Social Forum in Porto Alegre and elsewhere. He received an academic premium from the International Studies Association. I was there at that year in San Diego or San Francisco, I don't recall. I think it was Susan George who was giving the prize as an outstanding public scholar in 2008. He has already been, moreover, a member of the House of Representatives in the Philippines for 6 years. He's going to tell us why he's not anymore. Right? Then we have here the opportunity to hear and to discuss a little, particularly in this very important moment of our domestic politics and also of global politics, one of the leading critics of the current model of economic globalization, and who has very, which is not very easy to do, combined roles of being an intellectual and also a transnational activist. He's got many books published. The latest one I just received as a cadeau, as a gift, right? Capitalism's Last Stand, Deglobalization in the Age of Austerity. Right, published by Z Books. Well, I'm going to give the floor to Walden Bello, and you have between 30 and 40 minutes to give your speech, and then we're going to listen to Ademar Ribeiro, who is our fellow from the REBRIP, Rede Brasileira pela Integração dos Povos, very active also in the fight against many economic international projects that are being implemented currently. He's an economist and he's a specialist in WTO negotiations and so on. Right, and we're going to have something like 30-40 minutes for Walden, and then we have something like 10-15 minutes of comments by Ademar, and then we open for discussion with everyone. Okay? Thank you, Walden.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much to Professor Carlos Milani for inviting me here to share some of my thoughts about the current crisis of global capital and the role of the transnational social movements. I also would like to, very glad to be sharing the panel with Ademar, whom we have been together on a number of struggles over the last several years, although I have not seen him for a couple of years. I also would like to say that I'm very happy to be back in global civil society after 6 years in Parliament. Okay? And I just want to get rid of this right away. I resigned from the House of Representatives of the Philippines because I got into a fight with the President of the Philippines because he did not want to fire corrupt ministers in his government, and he had run on a platform of anti-corruption. So he used anti-corruption to go after his enemies, but when it came to his friends, he protected them. So I got into a big fight with him and the party, my party. I helped found the leadership, supported the president instead of me. So I decided, you can go to hell. I'm going back to civil society. Okay. So, is that on?
Yeah.
Okay.
but it's just for our global civil society purposes.
Okay. So, I think this year we are celebrating, a very important event in the history of, the developing world. And I guess many of you know what this big event is, right? Somebody just give it to me? Yes, the historic conference of Bandung. And so
Brazil was not there.
Well, yeah, Brazil wasn't there, but it was there in the spirit.
Very important.
Yeah. So what I would like to do is to broaden the assigned topic to me. And since this is the 60th anniversary of the historic Bandung Conference held in Indonesia in 1955, what I would like to do is to relate Bandung to the response of the progressive movement, including the anti-globalization movement, to the global crisis of capitalism. So let me begin by saying that Bandung in 1955 was a momentous historic event in the sense that the French philosopher Alain Badiou defines an event, quote unquote, a moment, a particular conjunction of forces and developments that illuminates the horizon of possibilities for social liberation. Bandung, which saw the Third World or Global South get together for the first time with iconic leaders like Zhou Enlai, Nasser, Sukarno, and Nehru, had the same significance as the French Revolution of 1789 and the Russian Revolution of 1917. It was a historic distillation of struggles, of the scores of national independence and national liberation struggles that had occurred till then and were still going to take place in the Global South. Bandung pointed to a reality seeking to emerge from the internal international structures of oppression and exploitation to a new era of freedom and equality among nations and within nations. Bandung represented the reality as well as the potential and the horizon of possibilities of global political and economic liberation. The wave of liberation represented in Bandung carried forward to the Cuban Revolution of 1959 and Algerian independence in 1962 and reached its apogee in 1973 to 1975 with the triumph of national liberation movements in Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. However, like the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, that glimpse of the horizon of possibilities offered by Bandung was succeeded by setbacks, by counter-revolutions inspired by imperialism. There were the bloody coups against Sukarno in Indonesia in 1965 and against Allende in Chile in 1973. Then there was structural adjustment and neoliberal structuring that accompanied corporate-driven globalization, whose main successes were the neoliberal transformation of the Indian economy beginning in the early 1990s, the capitalist transformation of China from 1984 on, and of course, the collapse of actually existing socialism in Eastern Europe. Like the Congress of Vienna in relation to the French Revolution after 1815, and the fascist and Nazi counter-revolutions in relation to the Russian Revolution, the aim of the US-led imperial reaction and the neoliberal globalization was to kill the glimpse of the future offered by Bandung. Yet, it was not only imperialism and global capitalism that propelled the retreat of the vision of Bandung. Factors internal to progressive forces were also at work, the most prominent being the prolonged deterioration and collapse of the centralized socialist regimes in 1989 to 1992, and the ossification or erosion of many anti-colonial movements into personalist, party, or bureaucratic regimes. This lapse into political formations that were the opposite of the Bandung vision, where the state became the property of a person, a party, or a social group, instead of becoming an instrument of popular liberation, was one of the factors that contributed to the attractiveness of the siren song of neoliberal restructuring in the 1980s and 1990s. The clouding of the horizon of possibilities offered by the event that was Bandung led to many intellectuals abandoning the promise of Bandung, some lapsing into cynicism, invoking its rhetoric but abandoning its substance, some embracing neoliberalism outright. Others remained mechanically faithful to Bandung, refusing to acknowledge the deviations or internal lapses of progressive movements. Others maintained their fidelity to Bandung, but also adopted a self-critical attitude, asking the question, where did we go wrong? I am mainly interested in the responses of this third group, the self-critical response that has kept faith in the Bandung vision, that did not attribute the retreat of that vision to the power of imperialism and capitalism alone. There have been 4 institutions associated with progressive movements at the time of Bandung, institutions that were seen as the instruments of liberation and equality that have been subjected to critical dissection: socialism, the state, democracy, and the party. First, socialism. Coming out of Bandung were different variants of socialism, to which many countries emerging from colonialism were generally sympathetic to: Marxist-Leninist socialism, African socialism, Arab socialism, among others. The version that dominated in the 40 years after Bandung was a top-down socialism, where the state controlled the means of production, bureaucrats managed the economy via central planning or something very close to it, and there was little or no genuine democratic participation either in politics or economic management. This created a deadly combination of inefficiency in production and political dispossession that made the populations of the decolonized and socialist worlds vulnerable to the blandishments of imperialism and capitalism, and culminated in the collapse of the socialist governments in Eastern Europe and the reintroduction of capitalism in China, Vietnam, and many other post-colonial societies from the 1990s on. Second, the state. In the visions of development that came out of Bandung, whether the national developmental vision or the socialist vision, the state was seen as the institution that would tame the market and corporations, serve as the engine of national development, express the general will, and realize the common good. In fact, in many cases, the state came to exercise the monopoly of coercion, political power, and economic resources by a new elite based on political party affiliation, ethnic affiliation, or intellectual educational privileges. In many cases, behind the rhetoric of national development or socialist development, the state became the engine of accumulation of a new bourgeoisie. Third, democracy. Formal allegiance to democracy was a common feature of many of the decolonized nations that emerged in the global south. But the reality in many cases was very far from democratic. Some had electoral democracies where elites competed for political power, but united to maintain unequal socioeconomic systems. And I guess both the Philippines and Latin America, we saw such regimes. Some developed Bonapartist democracies, where populist leaders discouraged institutionalization of democratic rules in favor of a kind of direct connection between them and the masses through mass mobilizations. Some were so-called democratic regimes that were actually party dictatorships that justified their aspirations to permanent rule in the name of preventing counter-revolutionaries from destabilizing society. Fourth, the party. Even where they were not socialist or communist in orientation, many post-colonial regimes emulated the democratic centralist model of a disciplined vanguard leading the revolution from above and monopolizing decision-making, since it felt it was in the best position to understand the dynamics of history. This led to many abuses, including the domination of the government by a parallel party system, the actual rule of middle-class intelligentsia over peasants, workers, and other marginalized groups, and the denial of human rights to groups and individuals that did not belong to the classes privileged by the party. The genocidal policies of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia from 1975 to 1978 was a tragic lesson of how a progressive political elite could go radically wrong, giving ammunition to the fundamental challenge posed by conservative intellectuals like Fourier, Johnson, and others, to the three moments of social liberation: the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Bandung Vision. Despite the setbacks suffered by these institutions of liberation, however, the masses throughout the South largely kept faith with the vision of liberation, equality among societies, and equality within societies offered by Bandung, many of them spontaneously, not even aware of the historic event that was Bandung. From the 1990s on, a major new actor reinvigorated the struggle for liberation and equality: civil society. Civil society is that complex of social sectors, social institutions, and social organization that lies outside both the market and the state, but interacts with them. Civil society is diverse, being composed of communities, social movements like the women's movement, solidarity formations like labor unions, functional groups, professional groups, and pressure groups. In the socialist national liberation or national independence models of change, civil society organizations were often seen mainly as passive actors to be harnessed to the objectives of the state and political parties. Even as governments and parties were drastically weakened by neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s, the inevitable social crisis of neoliberalism triggered the emergence of dynamic civil society groups that addressed the environmental, gender, social, and political equalities generated by neoliberalism. Civil society formations stemming from women's struggle for equality, indigenous peoples' drive for liberation, and the desire to protect the planet from devastation were a key new source of dynamism and creativity in the struggle to realize the vision of Bandung. Progressive civil society formations were united by a common stand against neoliberal policies. Three of their most influential incarnations were the anti-globalization or alter globalization movement, the World Social Forum, which Brazilian networks were instrumental in setting up, and more recently, the Occupy movement. These networks drew their strength from their decentralized operations, their participatory and non-hierarchical decision-making structures, and their ability to organize across borders, features which were celebrated in Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's book, Empire. These civil society networks have had an ambivalent relation to governments. On the one hand, the power of 50,000 people in the streets of Seattle, combined with the resistance of developing country governments, brought down the third ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization in 1999. On the other hand, governments, even progressive ones, have often been threatened by their activities, especially by their upholding of participatory democracy as a means of decision-making at all levels of organization. Perhaps the latest manifestation of this conflict between governments and transnational civil society is over the coming Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or COP21, which will take place in Paris in December. While governments have largely given up on binding commitments for greenhouse gas reductions, civil society networks are converging on Paris to force them to undertake such commitments for deep cuts in emissions, which are necessary to avoid the world moving to a disastrous 4-degree centigrade plus world by the middle or end of this century. These civil society networks have also had an ambivalent relationship to the traditional parties of the left. Despite these differences, however, they have worked together, the best example being the World Social Forum. Perhaps a compelling reason for the modus vivendi of the old and new movements was the realization that they needed one another in the struggle against global capitalism, and that the strength of the fledgling global movement lay in a strategy of non-hierarchical networking that rested not on the doctrinal belief that one class was destined to lead the struggle, but on the reality of the common marginalization of practically all subordinate classes, strata, and groups under the reign of global capital. The anti-globalization movement, of which I said Brazilian civil society networks were a central part, and its successor, the Occupy movement, showed both the dynamism of transnational civil society networks and their limitations. The strengths of these networks were oftentimes also seen as their source of weakness. Their decentralized character, their dislike of hierarchy and representative systems of decision-making, and their being averse to institutionalizing processes. A key problem has been the ambivalence of civil society networks towards power. It is, however, necessary to deal with power and to use it instead of just resisting its use. As Hugo Chavez reminded delegates to the 2006 World Social Forum meeting in Caracas, civil society activists had no choice but to address the question of power. And let me quote Chavez, "We must have a strategy of counter-power. We, the social movements and political movements, must be able to move into spaces of power at the local, national, and regional level," unquote. The crisis of global capital that broke out in 2008 is deepening. The third phase of the crisis, following the Wall Street crash and the European sovereign debt crisis, has been the lapse of the BRICS formation, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, its lapse into stagnation. At the same time, events in the Middle East have translated into a grave weakening of imperial military and political control. And of course, governments seem paralyzed as the world lurches on to a 4-degree centigrade plus world. Amidst this crisis, the vision of Bandung remains valid and inspiring. But to realize that glimpse of human liberation that it offered requires a deepening of the creative rethinking, reconfiguration, and rearticulation of the institutions or mechanisms of liberation that the progressive movement has developed as its main instruments for change. Socialism, or democratic economic ideals, the state, the party, democracy, and civil society. The challenge to us who remain faithful to the Bandung moment is urgent and momentous. In this regard, let me end by sharing a disturbing insight that came out of my investigation of the background of the 2 young people who carried out the massacre of journalists at the French publication Charlie Hebdo last January, Sherif and Said Kouachi. These 2 were offspring of Algerian immigrants to France, but their conditions of existence were very much like those of young people now growing up in the slums of large cities in many parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. With the erosion or ossification of progressive secular politics, ethnic, cultural, national, and racial themes came to dominate public debate in their world. For the youth of the slums, the vacuum created by the absence of the left had critical consequences. As one scholar put it, and I quote, "The traditional character of the left-wing activists supporting the population's collective protest is disappearing behind the religious figure embodying the alternative route for a dignified and moral life in a city, quote-unquote, outside the real world, in a community protected from a society perceived as being impure," unquote. Reading accounts of their trajectory, one cannot but entertain the possibility that in other circumstances, Sherif and Said Kouachi would probably have been ripe for recruitment into a progressive movement. But with no figure on the secular left remaining to provide guidance to their feelings of injustice and their idealism, that vacuum, in the case of Sherif, was filled by a devout jihadist of Algerian descent who tirelessly held discussion groups with impressionable young men, encouraging them to join jihad and setting up, according to one investigative report, a pipeline for young Muslims to travel to join Abu Musad al-Zarqawi's Al-Qaeda's network in Iraq. It pains me to say that, in fact, even as the U.S. intelligence recently admitted a few weeks ago, lots of young people are flocking to join ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And there must be something that explains why they are doing this and why progressive secular forces like ours cannot inspire them in a new way. It is said that nature abhors a vacuum. If the forces that value the vision of Bandung, that continue to be faithful to it, do not fill the vacuum by making it again inspiring today and tomorrow's youth, others will. Liberation is not inevitable, it is contingent. I thank you.